Greetings and welcome to the Dr. D Vlog series. It's Monday, October 6th, 2025, and on Mondays we talk about mathematics and statistics. So we're talking about tribes and tribalism this week. So I'm not sure how that relates to mathematics and statistics, but well, maybe you'll see in a moment. But I want to start with a very different question. So what's your ethnic identity, your ethnic background? What group or groups do you belong to? Most people have a sense of their ethnic identity, and some a very powerful, an overwhelming sense, often infused with a distinct sense of pride about their ethnic background. I always joke that since my father was 100% Polish and my mother's from Texas, but of mixed European background, shall we say, I used to like to say that I'm half Polish and half Texan. And I think at times it does feel like Texans identify as their own ethnic group, but that's another story for another day. What's obvious, though, is that we almost always identify ethnically with our parents and their cultural heritage, but especially if both parents are of the same ethnic background and we grow up in their care, obviously. That's the case. So from a statistical standpoint, we can say with almost 100% certainty that that will be our ethnic identity as well. And so there's nothing unusual in that regard. But there's an equally obvious mathematical issue at play here as well. In other words, if we belong to a certain ethnic group or tribe, and the people within that tribe cohabitate and reproduce, then that will obviously help sustain the tribe, and that tribe size will possibly increase too over time if the environmental conditions are favorable. And so while we've always been a tribal species, or at least for the 200,000 years or more that Homo sapiens have been around, again, it's difficult to say if we go back that far in time, but certainly the cultural products that are left behind in terms of the archaeological records dating back at least tens of thousands of years suggest that we've always had this kind of distinctive tribalism about us as a species. And in terms of modern history or written history, say from the last 5,000 plus years, tribes have thrived. Every known culture has some kind of tribal identity that distinguishes members from non-members, the in-group from the out-group, the us from the them. And so who are we? Who are you? And who am I? Well, we're the statistical byproducts of humans that belong to mainly the same, but sometimes the different tribes that have populated the planet. So we had no choice in the matter. Neither did someone who was born as a Han in China. And yet the Han in China constitute the largest tribe in the world, and in fact all of human history, with more than 1.4 billion people who identify as Han. That's a bit more than 1/6 of the world's current population. I wish I were a Han man, because then I'd have, well over 1 billion homies that I could pledge allegiance to, right? Again, they're the true global statistical majority, or the largest group, I should say, at least in 2025. But of course, it's more complicated than that, right? Because you have both huge population bases, such as the Han, or for that matter, the Indo-Aryans in India, the Arabs across many countries and cultures, quite frankly, the Japanese, and then people who identify with European or African ancestries, and many others. And my point here, of course, is that there are many typically subgroups or smaller tribes within these much larger configurations, these larger general groupings that are linked to language then and place and history. So for example, my first wife's 100% Dutch, okay, as opposed to the more generic term European. And so that includes, if you talk about the Dutch, more than 16 million who live in the Netherlands and identify as Dutch, and the roughly 15 million outside of the Netherlands who also identify as Dutch. And so that means the Dutch tribe, if you will, by most recent estimates exceed 30 million. But my current wife is 100% Persian, with a global population 3 times the size of the Dutch, and of course mainly located in Iran. So on the one hand, who are your parents? And what country and culture and tribe do they identify with? And were you raised in their traditions? Well, if so, then that's almost certainly your identity as well. From another perspective, though, as I've mentioned, we're effectively just statistical artifacts. We were born into the cultures and reared into our distinct tribes, and yet this is just by fate, by the luck of the draw, if you will, by the fact that we came out of this or that person's womb. And so consequently, we acquired, on the one hand, our genetic complements from those that were obviously involved in our procreation, but then they did something else, or the caregivers did if we were passed on to other caregivers, if we weren't raised by our biological parents. Some people aren't. But then they foisted their culture and their language and their tribal identities upon us. We weren't born with any of that. And so with varying degrees of intensity, they've impressed upon us the importance of learning their language, their religion, or lack thereof perhaps, their nationality, and certainly their family names and their identities in general. So here's my question. Since we're born into these tribes and we had no choice in that matter, does it make sense to argue that our particular tribes should be privileged, should be recognized, should be favored by God, maybe as God's chosen people or what have you? So seriously, think about that. Where does all of that come from? And why does it matter? So for example, in the first decade of my adult life, say the 10 years after I graduated from high school when I was 18, right? In that first decade, I dated an Asian woman briefly, but then had a serious girlfriend who was black, one who was Hispanic from South America, and then another who was Brazilian. And so had I stayed with any of those other 4 women that I dated, and if we'd had children together, they'd look vastly different than the 2 biological sons that I currently have, or ultimately ended up having. I mean, racially, and then by extension, their identities would have been linked to their mothers' tribes. I mean, to mine as well, but especially to their mothers. And those were all quite different than my tribe. That makes sense. But alas, as I mentioned, I married a Dutch woman, and we had 2 children together. And so the kids are, well, white and grew up speaking English and grew up here in Canada. So am I supposed to be proud of that fact? Well, historically and cross-culturally, the answer would be yes. For I too have a history and a heritage and tribes that I belong to and with which my ancestors identified. And what about the other cultural aspects of my identity, like being raised a Catholic? Am I supposed to take pride in that particular fact or tout that as the right religion above all others? Again, historically, the answer would be yes. And it would be very strange then that people would learn that, well, wait a minute, so you're a Catholic and you're married to a Muslim? How does that work? So we all have an ethnic background, some more complex and more nuanced than others, but we also have linguistic backgrounds and religious backgrounds, and these days usually a national background in terms of our citizenship. But all of that together, and we can talk about our country, right? Or we can talk usually more specifically about our people or our tribe or our kind. And then we can try to determine then how many people out there are like us, share that identity, share that background, however it might be defined. And so I want to conclude then with 2 observations. First, to reiterate, we had no choice in the matter of being born into our families and in certain places and at certain times, historically speaking. And I therefore pose the question again, does it make sense then on that basis alone to conclude, therefore, that you or I or Mr. Han in China should claim special status, or that our tribe deserves more of the earth's land and resources and power than those of the other tribes? And I can hear the words, the wheels turning perhaps in your brains, right? And some of you might automatically think, well, yes, of course, because every tribe privileges their own. That's just part of cultural reproduction. That's part of the human story. And then I can imagine that there are others are thinking, well, no, not therefore just on that basis alone, but there are other reasons why we are special, why our kind is special. Look at what we've produced. Look at our history, etc. Right? And perhaps, but my point is that those other reasons are all cultural constructions, justifications as well. They're not handed down from God, although some people believe they are. But again, what are you going to do? And so that leads to my second observation, though, which is that if we could go back enough generations, what would we ultimately find in terms of our history, in terms of our ancestry? that we've evolved essentially from one family or one tribe, or that we all share common ancestors, even if these date back 100,000 years or more. It's just hard to go back that far. It's hard to imagine, especially in the world today with a global population in excess of 8 billion people, that we're all somehow related. That's crazy, right? And look how different we look. Look at how different our cultures are. But of course, that's because we live in 2025 right now, right? And if we go back just 500 years, though, what would we find? We'd be looking at a still a very diverse, culturally diverse set of peoples across the globe, but we'd be looking at a population closer to maybe 500 million in total. It's still a huge number. Still difficult to wrap our heads around that. So what about if we go back 5,000 years? Again, we can imagine that. We have historical records and writings, etc. So let's go back 5,000 years. So some people place the estimates of the total global population 5,000 years ago somewhere around 15 million people. Now we're getting somewhere. Again, it's still a large number, but I do think it's the kind of number where we can at least start to imagine that we must have much more common descendants and ancestries, certainly than when we look around us today. Again, even though there still existed a fair degree of cultural diversity and often linked or in relation to the ecological conditions that prevailed on the planet at that time. Ah, Dr. J, sure, but again, it's 2025, and I have a passport that identifies my country, and I have a language, and I have an ancestry, and all of this has shaped my identity. So why do we need to even talk about all this other stuff and about some universal human history or condition or ties to the first human being? Well, because I think it's the singular most important issue that affects all of us and how we think about and live in the world today. And so I have a lot more to say about these issues as we continue to do this deep dive into tribalism this week and possibly beyond. We shall see. Because the implications of what I'm going to be suggesting are far more powerful and, dare I say, radical than what almost anybody's talking about today. And I do mean almost anybody, including the political pundits on the right and the left and so many others out there who are discussing issues around national identities and global, conditions and different tribes, et cetera, religions, you name it. So in the meantime, I'm going to ask that, as ever, that you and yours continue to create peace in your lives, nurture love in your hearts, and dole out hugs in abundance, and hopefully not just to people in your own tribe. Peace.